Alright, so what I'm going to do is kind of pick up on a conversation that we had a few weeks ago about some adaptations and evolution and kind of give you some more framework for what the theory of evolution by natural selection is and kind of walk you through an introduction to some of the evidence that we'll be talking about in class. So let's break down this term first. When we talk about the theory of evolution by natural selection, there are lots of ideas that are already out there about this of what this concept is, and I want to make sure that you don't hold on to some misconceived ideas about what this concept is. So let's review some of this real quick. I'm going to talk about some of this. I want you to add to your notes. So the theory of evolution by natural selection, it is a scientific theory. So if you look back at your notes from last year and earlier this year, scientific theory is an explanation of information, of data, of observations. It's based on data and observation, so it's our explanation of that information. So evolution is that observation. It is that principle that we see, and natural selection is the theory that explains evolution. So let's talk a little bit about what evolution really is. So evolution is not necessarily one organism changing to another type of species. It is not a human giving birth to a monkey. It's not a monkey giving birth to a human. That is not what evolution is. Evolution is simply, sorry about that. It is simply, and that's an oversimplification what you think, well, if you thought that was true to begin with, but evolution is simply the cumulative changes, let's call these genetic changes in a population. Right? So it's not a population that changes, an individual that changes. Instead, it's a population that changes. So you wouldn't say that you or I evolve. We are evolved from previous populations. Again, it's not one species changing another. It's just about how one population changes over time. And you might think, well, evolution doesn't happen anymore. It does. Or that we can't see evolution happen. We can. And we'll talk about redefining what evolution is. Natural selection, again, is the theory that explains evolution. And so you might know a couple of names that are associated with natural selection. So you might have heard of Charles Darwin. You might have heard of Alfred Russel Wallace or A.R. Wallace. They actually came up with this idea together, so sometimes it's called the Darwin-Wallace theory of evolution by natural selection. But Wallace has mostly been erased from the textbooks. There was somebody else who came up with the idea before Darwin and Wallace. It didn't get much traction. And then there's another name that, two other names that I think are really kind of interesting. Charles Darwin's grandfather, whose name was Erasmus Darwin, actually started coming up with the idea of evolution. Did not come up with the theory, but the idea of evolution. Was able to see that through fossil records and other data sources. And then we've got one more name who came before Darwin, and his name is Lamarck. And he has an alternate idea that has been largely disproven, but there's some ideas that are coming back. His idea is the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Oops, sorry about that. Characteristics. Okay, so, but I'm going to put in a little X next to it because we know that this idea is largely wrong. We go largely with the natural selection idea, but there's accruing evidence of acquired characteristics being happening in some situations. So, theory of evolution by natural selection is what we're really going to talk about. Alright, so in your notes you should have, let me just erase what I wrote here. So what we're going to do is redraw the diagram that you should have in your notes. So I want you to flip through your notes. You should have a flow chart, or you can just recopy it here. I recommend recopying it. Where we have variation and overproduction, we've got competition, survival, and then reproduction. And this is really kind of a flowchart that helps explain the idea of natural selection. We'll talk about the evidence in just a minute. So, so any population will reproduce, right? That's a characteristic of life. Do you remember dog racer? I'm going to add a little note up here that when we're talking about dog racer, what we're talking about are several different things here. So we're going to talk about genetics and DNA. We're going to talk about reproduction. We'll talk about, even energy and nutrients we'll talk a little bit about. Even different types of cells. If you go back to your notes on the endosymbiotic theory and the evolution of eukaryotic cells from prokaryotic cells, we're talking about cells. Definitely A for adaptations. Respond to environment is actually a product of evolution. And growth and development is a little different because this is about individuals. And remember, we're talking about populations here. So it's not really growth and development, but the capacity to grow and develop is something that you've inherited. And same with the organization. So we're going to be kind of talking about these ideas. So you might want to review what dog racer stands for in your characteristics of life. No, I'm not going to say you might. You should. You need to. All right, so we've got these ideas, and we're going to kind of add a little bit of context to it. And so what I've done is added a few notes, just a few, to this. I'm going to walk through this to make sure you understand this, and then we're going to extend this to a couple of examples. All right. So what I've annotated around variation is genetic variation. You and I have different preferences for things, which are maybe genetic, probably not, but we do have some genetic variation. We are not genetically identical. You and your sibling are likely not genetically identical, unless you're identical twins. And that variation is a good thing. The cause of that variation, that genetic variation, is meiosis and random fertilization. Those are the two things that led to the difference between you and a sibling, or you and your cousins, or your parents' siblings, differences between your parent and their siblings. It's all about meiosis and random fertilization. So meiosis, if you haven't learned anything about that yet in previous science classes, like in middle school, meiosis is this process of taking genetic information from a parent and taking half of that genetic material and making that available to pass on to the next generation. So an adult would be making sperm or egg that have half the number of chromosomes that they would possess in their normal body cells. So humans have 46 chromosomes, but the sperm of a human male would have 23 chromosomes, and the chromosomes in an egg from a human female would also have 23 chromosomes. It's not always the same 23 chromosomes. It's different mixes, with some constraints in there, but different mixes of those chromosomes, which lead to different sperm and egg that carry different chromosomes. And once you have those, you have millions of sperm that are available to fertilize an egg, and really there were millions of eggs, but only one released a month. There's an idea of random fertilization. We can't control which one is going to fertilize, which sperm is going to fertilize which egg. So there's some, as far as we understand, some randomness to that. There's also the idea of mutation. So only those things that sexually reproduce will go through meiosis and random fertilization. But all organisms, whether they sexually reproduce or asexually reproduce, will have an element of, or a factor of mutation that leads to variation. But reproduction also produces many, many, many offspring, well beyond the carrying capacity of that environment. They make more offspring than can survive. And that overproduction is critical for survival because there has to be competition. Now, we'll talk about why there has to be competition, but competition, as much as sometimes we like it or some of us don't like it, it is necessary for our survival. So when we compete because there are limited resources, or limited mates, or we want to avoid being eaten, that's predation avoidance, some of us are better at that than others. And when we talk about the genetic reasons that some of us are better than others, those reasons are what we call adaptations. And we want to be really careful about this. We don't want to be eugenic. That's not what this is all about. And we're talking about all living things, not humans. But those genetic variations that help in a particular environment are called adaptations. And these are things that we don't necessarily see. So when you learn about genetics in middle school, all of those genetics problems, I think most of them were about physical things that you can see about somebody. But every single protein in your body is a product of your DNA code. So every protein in your cell membranes is a product of your genetic code that you inherited, right? You inherited from your parents. And we don't see those from the outside. So it's much more than what we think we have conscious choice over. So these adaptations help some of us survive, and sometimes that survival is called survival of the fittest. But I do not like that language. I don't want you to use it. So I've only indicated it here because sometimes that's what you associate with it. But survival of the fittest is misleading if you don't know what fittest means. So fittest is not the strongest. It just means having the most offspring survive to pass down that genetic material to future generations. So if you only go one generation, if I have a lot of kids, you still don't quite have enough information to know if I'm genetically or evolutionarily fit or not, because you don't know how much genetic material gets passed on to the next generation or future generations. So it's this long-term idea, but because of that idea of fitness, we have this other idea that there are differential rates of reproduction. So it's not about if you've made it through this competition, you've survived, you're all set, or your ancestors are all set, or the ancestors of the bacteria were all set. Those things also have to reproduce more than other individuals in that population. And if they reproduce more, they're passing down more genetic information into future generations, which then change that collective cumulative genetic code in that population, and that is evolution. Sorry about the noise in the background. So that's the idea of how natural selection leads to changes in a population. This idea of competition is critically important because these things that organisms are competing over are variables. They're always changing. And so if we did not have overproduction and variation and the environment changed, it would lead to extinction. And that's what happens often with a lot of the crops that we grow. Farmers do not like the idea of variation. They depend on the idea of variation, which has led to really sweet apples or bananas or whatever other fruit or even animal that they're trying to grow. They want to minimize the variation once they find a product they really like. And so they don't allow things to go through sexual reproduction anymore. They just clone them because they don't want varieties that they don't want, right, that are no longer good or deemed good by us. And so we end up with these things called monocultures. So most of the potatoes we grow in the United States is dictated by the fast food industry. We grow lots and lots of russet potatoes, but and they're mostly clones. And so if there was something that came through that knocked them all out genetically, then we wouldn't have as many potatoes. That's what's going on with bananas right now. So all the bananas that we eat, the most of the bananas we get at the grocery store are plagued by a fungus, I think, in Southeast Asia, and scientists are now talking about when that fungus spreads across the world, not if it spreads across the world, but when it does, those bananas are going to be wiped out. So variation is critically important for the survival of a population. It may be good for you or me, but it may not be good for us as individuals, but as a group, it certainly is beneficial to our population so we don't go extinct. But sometimes the environment changes so drastically that the genetic variation that is in the population still isn't good enough, and that inevitably leads to extinction. All right, so I want to give you another visual here. So what I've given is an initial population that's represented by these purple dots and yellow dots, and there's some kind of filtering event. So some kind of competition. Maybe it's, if this is bacteria, I'm just give you a different example than humans. If these are bacteria, then there's a variation that we'll call purple and a variation that we'll indicate with yellow. And if some kind of chemical is introduced into the environment that the variation that's yellow is subject to, is vulnerable to, then perhaps they don't survive as much, right? So in the next generation, so this is generation 1, here's generation 2, we're going to see fewer of the yellow variety and more of the purple variety. And when they all reproduce, we're going to see more and more purple and fewer yellow. Maybe no yellow, but maybe some yellow. And that's what this differential rates of reproduction means, that we have fewer yellow. So if we were to look at the collective gene pool, or all the genetics that are available in this population, from this original generation to this final generation, we will see changes. And that itself is the definition of evolution. It's not this bacteria change into a new type of bacteria, a new species of bacteria. It's that there were genetic changes in the population. And that is simply the idea of evolution. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about, I'm going to remove some of these layers. We'll go back to this. So I'm going to talk about plant adaptations. And this actually connects really kind of interestingly to your water filtration project. So we've got several resources that are available that plants need. They need sunlight, water, air, and nitrates from the soil. And so we're talking about how plants do that, or how they get those things. And so let's talk about each one of these in turn. And I want you to take this diagram and kind of annotate on top of it. So plants, we know that plants need sunlight, and so they will compete over sunlight. So which types of plants outcompete or are best adapted, have the best adaptations for survival? Those that are taller, those that grow faster, and that have structural support in those plants, like large central vacuoles inside those plant cells, sturdy cell walls that help them stand up and outcompete their neighbors for sunlight. So those that are better able to do that will survive, right? And if they survive, they will be able to pass down their genetic material to future generations through seeds or spores, depending on what type of plants we're talking about. And then we end up with some variation. So some of those offspring could be taller, and some might not be taller, right? And those that are taller are going to outcompete those that are not as tall. I hope that makes sense. So these plants are going to get taller and taller and taller, except that there is a limit to that, right? There's maybe not enough resources, or if a plant needs a lot of resources to grow, and there's a limited amount of resources, it may be at a disadvantage. Same is true for water. Plants compete for water. How do they compete for water? It has to do with their root structures. So in some places, roots go down really deep into the soil. It helps plants stand up, so that actually helps with the sunlight as well. But it also is able to get water that maybe is deep in the ground. So depending on where the groundwater is, it might be actually tapping into the groundwater. Or if it rains and the soil type is such that water can retain in the soil for long periods of time and not wash away, then the plants are able to continue to access water. But in places like the rainforest, where it's raining every day, even in the dry season, roots do not go down deep. Roots go out wide, and they're trying to increase the surface area so that they can grab as much water as it hits the ground, so that other plants aren't getting it first. And it's not that they're consciously competing, it's just that those that were better able to do this outsurvive those that aren't. And so we see those that were successful. We see those that were able to outcompete, survive, and reproduce in order to do that. So the roots are not as deep, therefore plants are not as sturdy in the ground, and they fall over a little more frequently. Plants compete for air. They're looking for carbon dioxide in the air. So many plants have broad leaves which help them compete for sunlight, but it also increases the surface area, which allow for more stomata on the bottom side of the leaves to allow for gas exchange. Now you might know that sometimes in this idea of competing or retaining water, in some places where the air is really dry, there's a high transpiration rate. So water will be leaving those leaves, and therefore the plants may not want, or may not, and I won't say want with quotation marks because there's no want here, but the plants that have survived are not the ones that have broad leaves. They actually have very small, narrow leaves, like a cactus. The spines on a cactus are its modified, adapted leaves that minimize surface area, so they reduce the amount of air and therefore water that's leaving. But they don't really need lots and lots of sunlight, and cacti are usually on the smaller side of plants. Plants are also getting nitrates from the soil. So this is what connects to your project. Plants are living in dirt most of the time, right? They're living in dirt. Some plants live in the water, and they have certain adaptations. For example, they don't have a sturdy trunk like tree would, so that they can actually bend with the current, and they don't get knocked out of the soil with a strong current. They just bend over, which is kind of nice when you think about what kinds of adaptations they might need. They do not get they don't need to get water from their roots. Instead, water goes directly into their leaves. So they have these other adaptations that help them survive and reproduce. That give them advantages. But if you're thinking about trees that get nitrates from the soil, they have to be able to extract nitrates, which have charges, from the soil. But I want you to recognize that plants are also filtering that stuff out. They're filtering water and minerals and nitrates and phosphates out of the soil. The soil stays behind. So the soil does not end up in the inside of the plant. So the plant is actually filtering. And you could actually use a plant as a filter. And there are places around the world that do that. They pour water in one end of a stem, and the water that comes out the other end is clean, because the plant has pulled out chemicals. And that's kind of an interesting idea that you may want to consider employing. There's this other idea of mangroves. If you ever looked up what a mangrove is, I want you to do that. Mangroves are really really interesting. These are plants that grow in salt water. Okay, so they grow in salt water. So we know that what happens with plants in salt water is that if they were in a regular plant you put in the salt water, that water from the plant would actually leave through osmosis and enter the environment. That would shrivel up the cells. But mangroves thrive in salt water. And what's really interesting is that the way they do that is they pull up, let's say it's sodium chloride, NaCl. What they do is they bring in that sodium chloride. Remember, this forms an ionic bond. So what they actually do is concentrate this Na around the membrane on their leaves, and they pump chloride out, and then, or they allow chloride out because it actually is repelled by the cell membrane with its negative charge. And then that sodium gets pumped out, right? It gets pumped out with ATP, adenosine triphosphate. And so the plants actually end up with salt that's sitting right on the surface of their leaves. And they kind of caked in this white color because it's the salt that's sitting on their leaves. So they pull in salt water and they extract the salt out of the water. And so they're able to do that with these things with charges, which is really kind of a nice way to filter out water. And that's what mangroves actually do. So when there's runoff from land, mangroves, which live in the salt water or the brackish waters around the coast, particularly in Florida or even in the Chesapeake Bay, they will actually pull out some of these toxins. But what's interesting is that we're increasing the amount of contaminant that's going to the mangroves, and we're reducing the number of mangroves. So of course we're going to have problems in the oceans because we're not allowing for that natural filtration to occur. So here's my next question. Is the cell membrane actually a filter? Yes, it is a filter. And so what I want you to understand though is that when we look at that cell membrane, let me remove some of these things. This is our fluid mosaic model of the cell membrane. We've got our phospholipids, we've got our transport proteins, I've labeled hydrophobic and hydrophilic sites. I've added a negative charge to the outside of this cell membrane. This phosphate head, the circle that we've been drawing, actually carries a negative charge. And that's why sodium would build up on the membrane and chloride would be repelled from the membrane from my previous drawing or notes. Okay, so there is a little bit of a charge on the outside, and I hope you remember what the negative charge means as far as what's making it negative, whether it has lost protons, which no, right? But it's gained electrons. So when water moves across a membrane, it must move through a protein. It must move through a protein because it's polar, right? This is a polar molecule. And this protein is made specifically for water, right? So this channel protein has a very specific name. That protein is called aquaporin. Aquaporin. A water pore. It allows water in and out of the cell. And when it's moving down the water's concentration gradient, it's called osmosis. This protein is made specifically for water. And that protein is made from the genetic code. Remember, the DNA leads to RNA, which leads to protein. Right? So it's made from this genetic code, which you inherited from your parents, which is kind of cool. So if we were to follow changes in genetic material, which is what evolution is, we can actually use DNA as evidence. And so I'm just going to make a quick note on types of evidence that we use. I'm not going to go into this, but one of these is genetic evidence, which actually what we can do is compare DNA sequences or protein or amino acid sequences to look at relationships between different types of organisms. We could also we could be looking at anatomical evidence, which would include things that we call homologous structures, analogous structures, or vestigial structures. We could be looking at fossil evidence as indirect evidence, or we could be looking at an idea called embryology. Alright, so this genetic sequence, though, is the newest one, right, with the discovery of DNA and our newer technology of sequencing that. But these other forms are things that we've been doing for a long time, that we've known for a long time. This was evidence that was submitted by Darwin to make his claim of, to support his claim of evolution, and then he explained his idea of how it might work, or how he thinks it works, and we haven't seen any evidence to contradict it. In fact, the genetic evidence only supports this idea that Darwin came up with or is credited to, and we didn't have that genetic information then. We have it now, and it continues to support his idea. Okay, so I see that this video is like 2 videos long, so I'm going to stop.